Hello and welcome to Session 3D, Strengthening Services Through Peer Support. You're in the Improving Services track. My name is Joe Manny. I will be producing the event today, which means, of course, that I'll be running the technology. I'm going to run through our standard housekeeping script before we hand it off to the presenters today. And just so you know, this event is being recorded and audio is now broadcasting. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And that wraps up the tech for today. I'm going to invite Lori Curtis to unmute and take the floor. Lori?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone, for joining with us. We hope that you have had a wonderful conference. This is the last session of the track sessions. We have a final session coming up to kind of do a wrap-up and synthesis. So please join us for that after a break after this session. My name is Lori Curtis, and I am a Senior Program Manager at Advocates for Human Potential. I'm also a person in dual recovery, and I have been around the field for quite a while, and the issues around peers and peer support are dear to my heart, and I have watched the movement over the last multiple decades as we have evolved in a lot of ways and made huge inroads. Today's session, we have a couple of wonderful presenters that I am so excited to share with you. They are phenomenal women. Their bios are in your participant agenda, so you can read them on your own. But very briefly, Christina Love is a training and project specialist for the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition. And she focuses on intersectionality of oppressed populations. And I'm sure she will spend a little bit of time telling us what that means. She is a Aleut, a Native American, and a trauma survivor who has experienced co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. Our other presenter today is Deb Detter. And Deb has been a leading recovery advocate and developer of peer support and peer recovery services in New England for over 15 years. She's currently the director for Anchor Recovery Programs in Rhode Island, which I know she is excited to tell you about. And she has had numerous other positions within New England, including the Connecticut Community for Addictions Recovery. She herself is also in long-term recovery. So we have a group of people here today who get it and who are excited to talk to other people about it. So we are going to do this today as a little bit more informally than some of the other presentations that you may have experienced during this summit. We're going to take a couple of themes and a couple of questions all the way through, and then Deb and Christina will weigh in on that topic. They will also take some time to talk to you about their programs. We really are looking to you to bring some questions into the question box so we can keep this as dialogic possibly can. So our first question is, what is a peer? What is peer support? We've been hearing that all along. Do you have to have been in the hospital to have been a peer? Do you have to have bottomed out to have been a peer? Do you have to, what does that mean? Christina, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to say it's an incredible honor to be a panelist and to be a participant in the summit. It's been an incredible experience. I've grown up in recovery watching these webinars, and they've really enhanced my advocacy and my recovery. So thank you so much. And thank you for the question. So what is a peer? What is peer support? This is an incredibly important question for how we as a movement dedicated to supporting people who live on the margins unite through language and inclusivity. And what I mean is that the definition needs to include every condition of our human experience, especially every condition that requires a systems response, severe mental illness, substance use disorders, contact with the criminal justice system at every point with specialty on various crimes. We need peers for people who have been involved in organized crime like gangs and human trafficking, peers for perpetrators of physical and sexual assault crimes, peers for survivors of physical and sexual abuse, peers for housing and homelessness, peers for poverty, peers for sex workers, peers for education, peers for healthcare, peers for LGBTQ, peers for people whose first language is not English, peers for people with disabilities, peers for leadership to teach us how to grow, how to write grants, how to supervise our teams, and how to run organizations. And then what is a peer? What is peer support? To me, a peer to me is someone who has lived experience in adversity as well as resiliency. I've walked through fire and I carry with me the knowledge of how to survive and overcome. I'm holding hope for you until you can hold it for yourself. I hope that my story and strength inspires you to overcome your own pain. This is peer support to me.
Wow. Deb, what are your thoughts?
Wow. Hi, everybody. This is Deb Detter, and I'm also excited to be on this webinar, so thank you. That was awesome. So to add to that, when I think about a peer, and the way that we speak about it at Anchor is it's really a person with a lived experience of addiction and recovery. And for many of us folks, it's also co-occurring recovery. My staff and others will tell you that many of us also have those sorts of conditions. A lot of times people will say that a peer is someone with a lived experience of addiction, and I'm always like raising my hand and saying, and recovery. Recovery is actually the most important part because that's the part that we need to make sure that people hear about and learn about. That to me is really what the role modeling and the living proof part refers to as the recovery part. For us in Rhode Island, and actually New England, we work to train peers via a series of training sessions and supervision to do certain tasks. That's the idea, is that I come with my own experience, my own history, my own learning, and my capacity to be a mentor and a role model, but then I'm trained. I'm trained in certain skills that, like active listening and supporting and resource management and all of that, so that I can help you with what it is that you're trying to work on in your recovery. We talk a lot about building recovery capital. The other thing that we do that I've been really excited to do for all the years I've been doing this work is training people how to use their recovery story to be of service to others. As people in recovery, we've learned to use our stories in different medium to heal ourselves. We might have gone to 12-step meetings and learned how to use our story. For me, I was also in therapy. I learned to use my story, my experience to heal myself. But being a peer means that I use my story in a different way to try to teach and educate, to engage, to make connections with people, and to demonstrate that recovery is not only possible, but is a reality for millions of people, including me, and including you, the person I'm speaking with. So the story piece, we do a lot of training around how to use our story in a focused, strategic way to help people.
Guys, can I be both a peer and a clinician?
That'd be great. I'm the same.
So it's
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, and I think, Deb, you're talking about the lived experience and how to use that experience in the service of others makes a lot of sense. And I think, Christina, your comments about it's not just people who are in mental health or substance use recovery, but there's some shared experiences. And I might be a peer to people with mental health and substance use disorders and recovery, but I may not be a peer to somebody coming out of the criminal justice system. That's just not my experience. So I think what you're both kind of identifying is that, you know, being a peer is about, I think somebody said it in the chat, kind of a shared struggle, or that we've both been there. We get it. And I think there's another element as well that comes with peerdom, and that's a sense of equality isn't really the right word, but there's a sense of equity, a sense of power sharing in some ways, that our experience levels us in some ways. Thoughts?
You know, I think about this a lot because I've learned, and people who are in different recovery circles have taught me so much about what does it mean to be a peer to the individual. And like when I've met with different advocates, they've said to me, you are not my peer because your life experience doesn't match mine, which has made me think a lot about what that, like how to even relate to that and how to do that in a respectful way. Because one concern I've had as we've been training peers is that by using this broad term, peer, it can also have the assumption that that means that just because I have a lived experience and a lived recovery experience, that I can then relate to somebody with a different life experience. And I don't think that's necessarily respectful. I don't. I think that if I come to you as a peer, then identifying myself, making sure that we can connect in some way that's going to have meaning to you is going to be a critical thing. And so that's kind of an interesting edge in this movement, frankly, is what does it mean to be a peer to which groups? I'll leave that as a question.
Right. I often see it as like, view the word as humanity. Like there's so much vulnerability in saying like, I have gone through adversity, I've made mistakes, and this is how I've overcome it. And so I think that it's important, that we look at the different specialty groups. I mean, and what I'll talk about later is how there are some people that are born into inherently understanding different section of marginalized populations that you couldn't know otherwise. That's really important for the specialized. But I think that the foundation, and this is the most important part of understanding a peer, is the humility and like you said, the equality. I'm one human being here to help you. And I see that you're struggling with something, and I can relate to that. So we have shared pain, and we both, and it's really focusing on the commonalities. And this is what I love about the modality of peer support, because it gives us permission to make mistakes, which I think is so incredibly important for being human and for being happy and for being healthy, is that we acknowledge and we give ourselves permission in that.
The other thing, if I could just say one other thing about that the thing that I talk a lot with people is it's really about coming alive, if that's the idea, that whatever recovery is for you, it's about becoming alive in all ways, as you're saying, the whole humanity, being human, being fully what I'm meant to be in the world. And so that's the part that I think we can all relate to, is what does that mean for you? How can we help you find your way there? What kind of resources, what kind of supports do you need to move in the direction that will suit you in your life? That's that respect and humility.
One of the things you guys are saying is that the whole concept of being a peer is about finding a point of connection with individuals, whatever that may be, and a place of common reality, common experience. But that's really different than the role I play. All right, and I think that there's been some chat, and Deb Werner made a wonderful comment that, I might be a clinician, but I might be a peer, but my role is as a clinician. And that shifts things a little bit. And I think that begins to create some complexity when we begin to think about a peer workforce in behavioral health services. So, and what's special about us? I mean, are we just, trained staff? Are we people who get certifications in peer support? Is that a thing? What is unique about a peer workforce? Deb, you want to start us on that one?
I'd love to, because you just referenced one thing that I have struggled with so much. I was trained as a clinician and did clinical work for about 21, 22 years before I made the switch over to the world of recovery advocacy and peers. And I have to say that back then, when I was the trained clinician, I didn't really understand peer support, and I really wasn't supportive of it. I was actually more afraid of it because I was thinking, oh my goodness, what if harm is created? What if people don't manage boundaries or manage respectfulness or haven't learned what I've learned? How will that work? And so I was one of the people that talked against peer support, and I was in recovery. That's the other really interesting thing. So what I'll say is that I had no idea what I didn't know at that point. I really didn't know what I didn't know. And the more that I learned and the more that I saw, I started seeing the magic. And it's very powerful that for me, the peer, being a peer, and what's unique about it is that by just simply being what I am, being present as a person in recovery, right away acknowledges that I've been through fires, I've been through inner scorching, I've been through a life that's similar to what you might have been through. And so just my presence really helps to reduce the stigma and shame that the other person is feeling, because I know on a very deep level what it means to suffer and to struggle with this illness. And it's very embarrassing and hard when you're struggling with an illness that you can't manage or control, you're frightened of, or can't get on your feet. So for me, that's been one of the most powerful learnings. And to witness that, I really, again, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't get it, but doing this work for 15 years, I get it. To me, this is really what's making the difference. This is how we're connecting with people and really helping people find their way in a different way than clinical, than therapy, than counseling can. And I also think that having both, for many of us, is really powerful because I can meet with someone who's been through what I've been through that can help support me. At the same time, I'm doing some of that work with a therapist or doing the clinical work that I might need to do for my own situation. I'll stop for a moment.
What is unique about a peer workforce?
I love how you said the magic, because it is the magic. So the movement of peers is really born on the backs of people that suffered and died. I love the history of it. What we've been doing as a society is not working. Our systems are flawed, they're fragmented, they're hard to access, and sometimes they cause more harm. I apologize. Hopefully you guys can hear me well. I'm developing a little bit of a cold, so my voice is cutting in and out. So just let me know if I need to speak a little louder, I'll try. So the business of peers is very new, but the concept is incredibly organic. That's where the magic is. The modality structure of peers is dramatically different from other systems. And what I mean by this is that most of our healthcare systems are billing insurance for sustainability based off of the DSM-5 and the ICD-10, which are models that focus on diagnosis and deficits. The truth is that if we knew more about trauma, historical, generational, compound, compact, individual, community, collective trauma, we wouldn't have enormous books that describe the millions of ways that our minds and bodies protect us and keep us alive through various learned and adaptive coping skills. Our greatest resource isn't in a book. Our greatest resource and treasures are people. It's been people who've done the harm, and it'll be people that are part of the solution. Peers carry with them the ability to meet people's individual needs rather than asking them to change to fit our program. The peer model is strength-based and person-centered. Peers can fill in gaps within any part of the continuum of care. Peers bring with them a connection to community, and to culture, and we know that connection and community are some of the most important solutions for a lot of our societal ills. Peers in the workforce, and this is what you're talking about, they invite a healthier way of being. Peers are honest and humble about their experiences of adversity. We all know that people need to know that they're not alone, not just peers, but everyone needs to know that their struggles of anxiety, feelings of low self-worth, feelings of disconnection and isolation, that they're not alone in that. The model of peers invites the person as a whole with the fullness of their experience, whereas other positions are only part of us, like the quote-unquote, the professional part, asking us to separate ourselves, which for me has been unhealthy and on being both sides. I've learned that I can't leave my professional life at the door in a healthy way. I can't deny my emotions or my thoughts. And for us here in Alaska, we've made a lot of movement in talking about Western ways of thinking and coming back to some indigenous practices, looking at like the separation of self. For example, if my daughter is up all night sick, then I'm going to come into work tired and emotional and not my best self. I need permission to acknowledge my entire life experience in every situation, especially at work where I spend so much of my life. Another example is if I'm struggling financially, and that means I'm in survival mode, and my brain is in a place where there could be temporary cognitive impairment. Peers out of necessity for self-preservation or on a journey to be whole and integrated. Our very existence is an invitation to live different, to be more aware, to be present, to be honest, to be humble, teachable, open-minded. These are a lot of our principles of recovery that we practice in everything that we do. And the most important, I think, is that we talked about that some peers are born with an inherent understanding of oppression and marginalization that cannot be taught. This knowledge that people of color, LGBTQ, immigrants, people whose first language isn't English, or people who are born with debilitating illnesses, they need to know, number one, that they're not alone, and number two, that they can succeed no matter what.
Okay.
Wow. And so if I could just throw one thing in that I think you said, but I want to say clearly it's about hope, that all of that work that we do, all of that work that we role model, all of that we demonstrate is about hope. And for me, that's been the other thing that's so unique, is that you meet us when you come to meet with a peer. You meet us with hope, with community, with strength. And so that is right in and of itself says that, you know, this is possible for me, the person who's coming to look for support.
Yes, that's so good. It is all about hope. That's everything. That's what sparks and our synapses and makes connections in our brain so that we can think differently and live differently. And really believing that recovery is possible is what makes it possible. And having a human being that says it is possible, my existence is proof that it's possible.
Amen.
Amen. So we've talked a little bit about what is a peer and what is peer support and what is kind of special about what peers bring to a workplace. And that is a sense of hope, a sense of recovery, a sense of looking at things through a different set of eyes than more traditional services on some level. I would like to hear from each of you some of the ways that you are using peer specialists and peer services to strengthen and enrich the services for people diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, substance use disorders, and trauma. Christine, would you like to start us out with that? What are you doing?
Well, we are, so we've got a couple of different things that we're doing. So we do a lot of work with rural villages, and within the rural villages, and I'll talk about this later in my presentation, people identify, they choose to not identify as a peer or as a coach. And so we have elders, and we have other people in the community who identify as healers that have gone through the journey. So allowing them to use their own definition, I think, has been incredibly beneficial. And then also allowing them to use their own strengths. We've used a lot of empowerment-based advocacy with our communities and asking them, what is the problem? And then really looking to people who are closest to the problem and asking them, what are the solutions? What would be helpful? And so, like with our street outreach, then what we found was that people had a lot of accessibilities, and that for the people who needed services most, they had the most complications with accessing entry-level services. And that could be a whole other presentation, not just with getting bus tokens to take the bus and navigating the bus, or not having a cell phone, or not having a watch, or not knowing what time it was, or not being able to make appointments, but then all of the other debilitating emotional, physical, and psychological responses that come into trying to access, for some people, a Western system, And so really trying to meet people where they are, and bringing, so we would do like monthly food gatherings, and everybody would bring it like potluck style, and we would pick one of the locations, one of our shelters, and everyone would bring food, and we would advertise it by going out underneath the bridge and to where people were and letting them know that, hey, we were going to have somebody here that can sign you up for public assistance. We're going to have somebody here that can help you out with housing, or that can help you out with Social Security, disability, or and then we called it, you're the captain of your ship, get to know your crew. And so all the providers would take turns talking about the different things that they do and how they could be supportive. And we talked about what it looks like to build wraparound services. So when you have a meeting, then you're meeting with all of the providers at once. Or if they needed to, then we would bring all of the providers to them. And peers were so fundamental in every part of this, because they had lived on the streets themselves, or they were already in the shelters. And so there was something yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think it's one of my favorite things that I've heard in this is that giving people an opportunity to help, so then they're not always receiving help. I think that is a fundamental part of healthy relationship, is that reciprocity and allowing people to empower themselves.
Keep going, Christina. You were going to talk about your program. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me go back to the beginning. Okay. Koyana, Kunashtish. My name is Christina Love. I am Alutiiq. My family is from Igigik, located in the Bristol Bay region of Alaska. I was raised in Chittenden, Alaska. That's on Athabascan land in the interior. I currently live in Juneau on Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian land. And this is a formal, traditional way of introducing myself as an Alutiiq woman. I work for Alaska Statewide Coalition on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault as a specialist on intersectionality with a primary focus on trauma, substance use, and mental health issues. I am a person in long-term recovery from IV heroin use and other mind-altering substances. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse as a minor, as an adult, domestic violence, and suicide. I have mental health disorders I'm someone who's experienced homelessness and incarceration. Let me find my mouse. I love this picture. This is a picture of my childhood home in Chittenden, Alaska. It's a trailer with an addition built on it. Growing up, I loved the blue roof because it made our home look more like a quote-unquote real home. The back of the house is up against a stream that ran year-round, allowing us to haul water for clothing, dishes, and bathing. On the right is a dip net leaning against a woodshed. This is a reminder of subsistence fishing with giant nets and splitting wood for heat. I love this picture, and I'm so proud of where I grew up. As a child, I was ashamed of living in a trailer. I was ashamed that we were poor. I was ashamed that we lived in the village and that we didn't have running water or anything but wood heat. I was 12 years old when my father was put in prison for sexually abusing his own children. By 12 years old, I'd already experienced a lifetime of trauma and coping, and I was blacking out from drinking and disassociating from trauma. I was also embarrassed to be Alaska Native. There's a lot of stories in our society that I was not taught. These are stories I caught. As a child, I was afraid of growing up to be like my family. Most of my family died from alcoholism, suicide, or alcohol-related death. Society taught me to hate the part of myself that was Native because society said that Native people are drunks who can't take care of their children because they're poor and stupid. Society also has a lot to say about women, too. Very early on, I learned to abandon my authentic self. This is a picture of my daughter, Emma. We're sledding at the Mendenhall Glacier on Christmas Day here in Juneau, Alaska. My personal work of recovery is to be integrated and whole, to speak to my inner child and say it's not your fault. You're worthy of love and protection. Everything that I do on a small scale, I want to do on a large scale. I want to be part of a solution that brings our systems through the recovery and healing process that many of us have been on. While I was incarcerated, it was liberating for me to think of myself as a political prisoner, the same way that I looked around in speech therapy class and saw only brown kids from the village, separated from everyone else. In prison, I looked around and saw a lot of other people who were struggling to overcome the abuse that we've survived, and that I later learned that we survived for many, many, many generations. It's profoundly important to me that we as a society change the narrative of what people say about people of color and people who've lived on the margins. When we understand the historical pieces that have been left out of the story, we stop blaming ourselves for how we survived. As Father Gregory Boyle says, here's what we seek, the compassion that can stand in awe of what people have to carry rather than in judgment of how we carry it. And as my Indigenous mentor, Elsie Boudreau, says, no wonder. If we were taught in school the facts of historical, generational, collective, compound, compact, community, and individual trauma, then maybe we'd stop blaming ourselves and maybe we'd stop blaming other people. It's so important to understand how societal narratives and public opinions change policy and create structural and institutional racism that further compounds trauma and systemic abuse. This is another picture of our glacier. I took this just a couple of weeks ago. Many of you are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. This can be summed up as when bad things happen to you as a child, then more bad things happen to you. Perhaps a more pervasive study would look at the collective and community experiences to prove what Indigenous and people of color have known. Historical, generational, collective trauma, oppression, power, and control are the underlying causes of violence. Trauma is the underlying cause of coping mechanisms. Substance use and mental health issues are our brain and body's way of coping to survive. Adverse childhood experiences are not the entire picture. It is not destiny. There is resilience, adaptability, and our strength, brilliance, and determination to survive adverse experiences that should have killed us but didn't. There isn't a scale to measure the stories that our backs carry. Data is so incredibly important, but we have to remember that it often leaves out intuition and experiences that don't have names or definitions yet. Here in Alaska, there are many of us who are working to tell the story of our people, our adversities, and our journey to overcome the impossible. We believe that the stories left out of some history books are the ones that we need to hear. We need to know that there are heroes of all colors. There are also many of us that work with communities and organizations to be equitable. We believe that like individuals, communities have within them the knowledge of what they need to overcome. Our positions of privilege are to make sure that our people's voices are heard and that they have access to tools that were taken from them. There isn't anything wrong with any of them. There are only things missing. This means that we recognize natural leaders that are already in our community. Other systems would call them peers, mentors, coaches, but we call them elders, healers. No matter the name, their role is rooted in traditions, stories, dance, drumming, beading, berry picking, basket weaving, and ancient knowledge that needs to be handed down, along with other supports. We recognize that there are many pathways out of addiction, mental illness, homelessness, and trauma. That means that not everyone will come into contact with clinical services. It also means that not everyone will identify by clinical definitions. We see community healing as well as individual healing because we know that communities have to be healthy enough for us to grow back into. Can you change the slide?
Yeah.
Lost my mouse. Okay. So this is a picture of the long road to my home. This is the road that leads to Chitna. This picture was taken at the Edgerton Cutoff here on the Alaskan Highway. I often think of this as my long road home. This past November, the State of Alaska's Division of Behavioral Health released a full report of 3 work groups of providers and peers that focus on peer support certification, collaboration, education, and advocacy. We have great hopes that our team's recommendation will be part of Alaska's 1115 waiver. This work was done in partnership and guidance of SAMHSA's Bringing Recovery Supports to Scale Technical Assistance Center Strategy, brass tacks. As a state, we recognize the vital part of peers in our behavioral health care system. We've created positions within our state for peers to provide support for changing systems and workforce development. It's a long road that we've been on to improve workforce for peers. We followed in the footsteps of many other states, but our difference is really found in our geography and our cultural diversity that makes up 40% of all the Alaskan tribes of part of the U.S. That's over 200 different cultures, traditions, and language. My position here at the Alaska Network focuses on organizational and community healing through accessibility, cultural responsiveness with a social justice lens. I was hired because of my expertise as an Indigenous woman who survived trauma, as a person who was denied services to behavioral health programs, shelters, treatments, and other entry-level services, and as a professional that works to improve access and services. I now get to work with the same programs who denied me access. My goal is to make a way for other people like me to be part of our systems change, education, and advocacy. My hope is to create as many seats at the table for people with lived experience as possible. Our hope is that we would never have closed-door meetings or meetings without people that the policy and practice would directly impact. We need to look to those who live on the margins, who have survived so much with so little. They have all of the solutions. We know that it's our best for our own lives and that we can help. This is the definition of autonomy, self-determination, and sovereignty. This is empowerment-based advocacy and services. It is healing informed. I'm an advocate for other advocates, and I think this is one of the things I'm most excited about. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay. So that means that I work to dispel a lot of us and them by working with staff who do not openly identify as peers. I work with professionals who provide services to people who have severe mental illnesses, substance use disorders, disabilities, housing and homelessness issues, contact with the criminal justice systems, and direct service providers for people who experience physical and sexual abuse. And the thing is that the things that they are struggling with are all the same things that they're providing services for. The only difference, as someone mentioned in the comment box, is that they're sitting in a different seat. And so there's a lot of them, professionals, that don't feel safe about opening up, about being open or honest about their experiences of mental illness, substance use, or domestic violence, or even their experience with the criminal justice system. They're afraid that their spouse will use this information against them, that they would lose their job, that they would lose their kids, that people would judge them, or they'd lose respect and status, all the same things that people struggle with. I'm going to save my voice, but I have some other programs that we can talk about.
Okay, we may circle back to that, Christina. Thank you so much. When I listen to you, I am reminded that you exemplify in so many ways the blessing and the beauty of what peers bring to our service system. You gave us a good example this afternoon of how a personal story can be not just motivating, but also inspiring and healing for others, and also serve as some of that adverse experience and what you call living on the margins can be a springboard into making positive change, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others. And I think you exemplify that so beautifully. Deb, we're going to shift to you. We'd like to hear about your programs and what you're doing at Anchor Rhode Island. And your approach is really different in Rhode Island than it is in Alaska. They're kind of one big state to one little state. But love to hear what you're doing. Would you share, please?
Great. Thank you. Christina, thank you so much. That was powerful. Thank you. So I'm excited to talk about the roots of our work first as a precursor to talking about anchor services. As mentioned, I've been doing recovery advocacy and peer support services for the last 15 years. Really, what got me hooked was the advocacy piece. It was so interesting when I started learning about recovery advocacy, about the ways that we could change people's attitudes and beliefs. When I first started seeing people talk, like as a person, like I'm Deb Detter, I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means I've not used alcohol or drugs since June of 1985. When I would say that to people and then start talking about my story and my experience and using some recovery paradigms, it would be really powerful to watch lights go off in people's eyes. And so I just want to say a few words about the recovery advocacy movement. William White, it was early, I think it was around 2001, coined the term the new recovery advocacy movement. This is a movement that started kind of gearing up in the late 1990s, where there was a resurgence of people who wanted to use the recovery stories to teach about recovery, acknowledging that recovery really isn't in the social, it's not in the media, it's not in our mind, it's not in the streets, it's not really a public reality. And so the idea of that was, how do we lessen stigma and discrimination by talking about recovery and teaching about recovery? So those were the roots of our work, and it's work we still have to continue to do to keep this work, the peer work, alive, frankly. That's partly why I always want to mention that this is really grounded in the work of a lot of the advocates that were coming up at that time, and I was one of them. So that's what caught me and started moving me along this path. Let me talk about Anchor. I'm really excited to tell you about our programs. Anchor Recovery Community Programs, I love to do this like as a hub, where you see the center as a hub. I think that the reason any of our peer services works at all is because we have a central place, and that is the Recovery Community Centers. And I'll say a little bit more about the model in just a little bit. Anchor has actually 2 recovery centers for adults. We have a teen center, which is a pretty new center, and you can see that there. It's named after Jim Gillen, who was the founder of the Anchor back in 2010. Off the other spoke you see is Anchor More. I'll talk more about that. That's our mobile outreach team and some of the outreach programs that we have. And then we have recovery coaches in the Department of Corrections and recovery coaches in the EDs. And so I'll focus specifically on our outreach programs. What I will say is that the reason that any of our services work is because we have this very big kind of web and network of services. We find that we can wrap around the folks that we meet in different ways. If we see you in the emergency department and you don't engage with us, we might run into you on the streets as Anchor More. Or you might come into our center looking for some kind of services. So this whole network has enabled us to really provide a lot of supports to folks. I think I went through, no, I'm doing good. Peer recovery supports facilitate the development of recovery capital. This is language that I think is really important. Coming up through the ranks as a clinician, I learned how to focus on people's impairments and problem areas and where they were broken down and helping them build that. This model really looks at people from a strengths-based model. The idea of recovery capital is, how do I look at you as a person with strengths, with resilience, with survivorship already? Even if you're in the emergency department, I can look with you at what are the strengths that you have right now. You survived this overdose, so we wanted to help you build on the foundation that you have. The definition of recovery capital is basically the inner and outer resources that help us to initiate and to sustain recovery. And the way that William White, and you can see the reference to the folks that coined this term, it really was geared originally towards severe AOD, alcohol and other drug problems. But I love the concept of recovery capital as a strengths-based model for pretty much everything. How do we help you build capital? So back to the center. As you saw in my little diagram, the centers really are our central hub of the work that we do. This kind of describes what a recovery community center is. The way that I love to think about it is that a center really supports the many pathways of recovery. I like to talk about how do we help you find the flavor of support that's going to help you in your journey. It may be SMART recovery, it might be 12-step recovery, it might be medication-assisted recovery support. There are many different ways that people start recovery and sustain recovery. And many times, for many of us, especially someone like me who's been around a while, I've used different methods, different pathways at different times. I've switched around. And so if you're going to have a whole life, you're going to want to use a lot of different supports. The little phrase here, this is the predominant phrase that we use, and we really mean this. Everything we do is geared around how can we help you with your recovery today. Recovery coaches. At Anchor, we tend to call them recovery coaches, but the field is calling them peer recovery specialists. I don't really care what we call them. It's still pretty much the same idea. It's a person with a lived experience, as you just heard, who has training and serves as a role model, demonstrating that recovery works. I know that when I began recovery, and again, it's been a while, but I did not believe that it was possible for me to heal and for me to have a full life. I believed I was going to die of my addiction. I believed recovery was going to kill me, to be quite honest. When I started in that dark tunnel of recovery, I just thought my life had come to a complete end. And so the only thing that helped me was meeting people and seeing people who were doing it and who had a month under their belt or a year under their belt. The 1 year thing was pretty incredible to me. And then meeting other people who had time in recovery just kind of blew me away and made me realize that this was available to me as an opportunity. I would have had no other way of knowing. So for us, doing this work, that's really the critical central part of what we try to do, to remember that my recovery is really what I bring to the work every day. And Christina mentioned this, and I think we've talked about this a bit, that community is really what heals. And so all of the work we do is focused around building community. And I think that being a recovery coach is about being in community with other coaches so that I can do the work in a powerful way. Next slide, if it will work. So let me focus a little bit on some of our programs so you have an overview of what we do and how we do it. And then again, any questions you have after we'd love to talk about it. We have Anchor ED, and that's our emergency department program. Back in 2014, there was an acknowledgement, Jim Gillen, who was working here at Anchor, and the state leaders started talking about how could we intervene with people who are having opiate overdoses? How could we maybe meet them right where they are, maybe intervene in the middle of a crisis and help support them to get into a recovery path? So they put some money towards Anchor ED, and it was really, at first, just an evening, weekend kind of program because that's all that anybody could afford, and that was a pilot. And so at this point, these years later, 5 years later really, we are now at the point where we have 24/7 services, and we now serve every Rhode Island hospital at all times. The hospitals are mandated to ask each person that comes in with an alcohol or drug-related crisis, would you like to meet with a recovery coach? And if the person signs a release and says yes, we're called in on dispatch. And I'll say more about that. The other thing I wanted just to mention is that what's unique in Rhode Island is that we have a Governor's Overdose Prevention and Intervention Task Force. That formed, I won't even guess, 3 or 4 years ago, and the governor put a huge commitment on how are we going to deal with this whole opiate epidemic problem? How are we going to help people not die from this illness? And so people have been meeting now for all these years trying to figure out strategies for, we've got a 4-pillar model, which is prevention, intervention, recovery, and treatment. And so how will we help people with all those life areas? That really drives a lot of our work because money isn't put to the services that we have, and we get a lot of support from that opiate task force. So are they effective, the services that we do in the ED? We think so. In 2018, you can see the stats here, so I won't read slides because I think that's always kind of boring. But you can see that we responded to a lot of calls. Some of what we've learned that I continue to be fascinated by is that 2/3 of the folks that we meet in the emergency department are men, and twice as many people are there for alcohol-related crises. This started, as I mentioned, as an opiate intervention strategy, and as we've done it, we never said, no, we won't come out for folks who are struggling with alcoholism. And so as we show up over and over, we're finding still that there are many more alcohol-related crises than there are opiate, which, again, that's also on the rise. We're not really talking a lot about it, but we're seeing that in the emergency department. Switching gears to our outreach program, we have what we call Anchor More, and this program has been running for the last 3 years. That means mobile outreach recovery efforts, and a lot of the folks that we serve in all of our programs are folks who are homeless. So I also wanted to note that. But this program here is the one that really interfaces more with those communities. Anchor More goes into like encampments where folks are in tent villages. They go out to the streets. They go out to the soup kitchens. They will talk to you in different areas and might approach you to ask if you need recovery help. And you can see the numbers here. It's I think it's pretty incredible work, frankly. I've worked in 4 states now, and I've not seen this kind of service anywhere. So it's been really exciting to know that we've got an outreach team, we have an ED team, we've got the coaches in the centers team. And one of the other powerful things that we can do is I think I may have said this, but if we meet you in the emergency department and you don't want us, the outreach team might pick you up. They might see you somewhere else and be able to see if they can engage you. So the goal that we have with all these services is engagement. Engagement, engagement, engagement. The other team that we have is we have recovery coaches that go inside the prisons here in Rhode Island. We've got 3 men's prisons and we've got 1 women's prison, and we've got recovery coaches that go in every week and meet with people one-on-one, and they do groups there. We also have recovery health navigators that help folks who are getting ready for discharge. And the goal of those services are, again, to help you with recovery on the inside, to help you with resource management for as you prepare to leave or as you live on the inside. So it's really about removing barriers. The navigators, in addition to being on the inside, provide safe rides when people leave and go to treatment programs. We can drive you there, and they will connect with folks and help you get into, we have what's called a homecomers group on the outside, that you can come to the center once a week and sit with folks who have been released from incarceration and who are trying to live lives on the outside. So we address everything in those sorts of groups. And the same navigators are available to coach you too once you come to the outside. So I will mention too that Rhode Island is one of the first states, we might even be the first state, to provide medication on the inside of the prison. There is methadone, Suboxone, and Vivitrol available inside Department of Corrections, and the coaches inside will work with you around providing the recovery support while you use medication and then helping you get connected to medication resources on the outside and maintaining your recovery. We have found there was a high level of overdose and death, frankly, when people would come out from prison because their tolerance had changed. They'd come out, try to use the same amount, and then would not make it. So this was a way to try to help more people manage recovery and stay in recovery. It's been really, really powerful. I don't have the statistics here, but we're really excited about it. Oh, good, and that was it. So that's pretty much what I have. I'd love to answer questions after.
All right, Deb, I know you have a whole lot more. And one of the questions that actually did come in, I want to talk to you, I want to confirm that the programs that you have described, the Anchor ED and the outreach and the prison support teams, those are they 100% peer run? Is it a mix of peer and non-peer staff?
Thank you. I forgot that. And yes, everybody who works on the inside, everybody who goes on the outreach, everybody is a person in recovery. A minimum of 2 years and is trained to be a recovery coach. We think that's critical because it's really about lived experience. It's about meeting someone in the middle of a crisis or in the middle of a really difficult situation as someone who's been there. Inside the prison and in our homecomers groups, those staff also have been formally incarcerated purposefully because we want to help, again, role model and support people.
I want to ask you a question, Deb, in particular, that, and Christina, you can weigh in on this as well if you would like. One of our participants, actually a couple, have talked about some concerns about high turnover in peer programs or in peer support specialist type positions in other types of agencies, more traditional kinds of agencies. Can you speak to your experience with that? Are you seeing high turnover? What would be the causes and how might you address that?
Are you asking me? Because I'd love to take that.
Yeah.
Okay. What's interesting in Rhode Island, again, what's unique about Rhode Island is a huge commitment because of the opiate task force. A very big commitment has been made towards developing a peer workforce in the state. So there's a lot of people that are trained both through our organization and through Parent Support Network to become certified peer specialists. So this state has a lot of paid staff who are peers. So there might be turnover within certain organizations, but people stay in the field and keep growing in the field often. Here in Rhode Island is what I'm seeing. And I also think that the critical thing that we really work to do at the Anchor is to build a community of peers. Like, I don't think this work can be done in fragmented ways where you send someone out or someone works at, say, a treatment organization or a hospital as a sole recovery coach or peer specialist. I don't think that's a model that works at all, because I think it isolates people. They get clinicalized, if you will. They're often supported by people who are clinicians, and they lose the peerness. I think they start losing the point of this work. So we really build a community where we come to work every day as a peer community, and we work to build community in some really strategic ways here at our organization. And so I think that helps people to stay around longer. That's just kind of the reality, because you're part of a network, you're part of a community. And community is what heals and keeps us all going. The other thing that we offer here, and I was going to say more when we talk a little bit about the training and support, but I think it's important, is that we provide a lot of training at the Anchor, and we also provide tuition assistance because we're part of a larger organization. And so a lot of our staff are people who are going to college for the first time or being trained in other kinds of areas and stuff. And so that has also contributed to people having more longevity with the organization.
Christina, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I would absolutely agree that having the community, I think what we've seen a high turnover rate when peers are on their own or trying to integrate peers into other systems. We haven't had a lot of success here, and I would say that's because there's difficulty around sometimes the job description. There's a lot of organizations that aren't very clear about what peers do, and so we've had some difficulty with peers doing tasks that nobody else wants to do, driving people around and really not meeting to the fullness of what a peer is and what they do. We've also struggled with fair pay, and that being an entry-level position into an organization. Without an avenue to continue to rise. And what we've seen is kind of the identity of peers themselves when they are in these other systems. And peers want to, I hear a lot of peers say that they want to be a clinician, they want to be a counselor. I mean, and from my understanding, I think that there could be no greater job than being a peer, just the modality of it and how much time you get to engage with people and really meeting people where they're at. And if they knew, how little time our medical or clinical staff are really able to, because of funding restrictions, pour into people, then I think that, then they would feel, a greater sense of value for their position. And so those are some of the things that are really we're struggling with here in Alaska.
If I could just say, I completely agree with Christina. What you just said was really critical. The pay scale is not good here either, and that is one reason that people turn over or want to go on to other fields. I also agree that I think the peer work is really where it's at for me at this point. I'm really still lit up by the fact that we get to do this and meet people in the ways that we do. When I was starting out in this work as peer recovery advocates, we were very worried that the field was going to put peers in place and then make them into mini clinicians and underpay and undervalue them. And that is happening. It is happening everywhere. I look around and I go, oh my goodness, because I think this work really deserves to be paid at the level that it's worth. I think that it's undervalued financially because of, folks don't have necessarily the training or the college or other sorts of skill level. And I don't know, I just think that's a problem. I'm hoping we can correct it.
It is a problem, and certainly some areas have worked to correct it by making peer services or applying to make peer services Medicaid reimbursable or Medicare reimbursable, and that's a double-edged sword for a lot of people because it comes with a lot of strings attached and things that you must do, and it's a step towards that professionalization. At the same time, it's one of the key sources of income and revenue to be able to try to track or change those salaries. The INAPS, the International Association of Peer Support, is a professional association that does regular surveys on salaries across the country, and that's worthy to check out, particularly if you are looking to lobby to make some of those changes. I think one of the points that you both made about minimizing and staying away from tokenism in hiring, we have a peer, is insufficient. I mean, that really does single people out. It targets them in a lot of ways and puts a lot of responsibility on people's shoulders. The other thing that I think you mentioned too is not just the job description, but it's people stay in jobs when they're well placed in jobs. In other words, when there's a good fit, both in the work that's done, the call on my knowledge and expertise and what I'm getting paid. There's a lot of factors. And I think as employers, we have a responsibility to hire the best people for the jobs. And I've seen over the years a number of organizations who will hire a peer simply because they're a peer and not necessarily underscore the importance of training, ongoing training, the kinds of inherent knowledge that you talked about, Christina, that sense of personal empathy and ability and interest in that. So I think sometimes we get turnover because of poor hires, frankly, and that's the same with any other staff, peer or non-peer. In terms of supporting and supervising a peer workforce, as peers, do we need something different than anybody else in an organization? Are there unique needs? How do you best support and supervise a peer workforce?
I'll take the question.
Okay.
I love this question because I think that this is a question that really speaks to an us and them that we're really that we're working to break. So for me, I don't think that there's a discipline that I know of that wouldn't benefit from supervisor or leadership training skills. There's a lot of people in management and leadership roles or supervisory roles that haven't received adequate training on how to support or encourage or foster growth and healthy relationships for the people they're responsible for. Again, for me, I believe that the root cause of my mental illnesses and substance use disorder is trauma. The trauma that my people have survived, the trauma that my community has experienced, and the trauma that my family and myself have endured. The underlying cause is trauma, historical, generational, complex, compound, and individual trauma. The most important thing that I need in a supervisor is to be trauma-informed. My supervisor needs to know that I've been to jail, that I've lived on the street, that people who are meant to protect me harm me, that the person I loved tried to kill me. This means that I don't respond well to authority, to power, or privilege. This means that I need my supervisor to not ever call me into her office, even if it's to tell me I'm doing a great job. To be trauma-informed, to recognize her own power and privilege and really work hard to not abuse it. And this requires people in leadership to do the same work that we and peers are doing in our recovery process. Leadership is about serving, it's about teaching, and it's more than modeling principles and practices and professionalism. It's about giving people these experiences. And so it is about building trust and learning to listen and learning how to educate people in the way that they learn, not just the way that we have learned ourselves. That's a really important bit of knowledge for everyone to know, that if there's something that you're not retaining, it has nothing to do with your intellect. It just might mean that you're not learning it in the way that you learn. Helpful leadership is strength-based. It's about reciprocity and seeing the inherent value of each person and being prepared to learn from them. Of course, one peer helping another is without parallel, but as a survivor, I've had many supervisors in my career, and none of them were peers. They were amazing because they believed in me and they helped me feel connected. I think that, so a lot of the things that we're doing here in Alaska, and I really look to Deb and what you're doing there in Rhode Island. Everything that you're doing there, we would love to have, and I would love for peers to supervise peers, but because we don't have the same capacity, then we have to think about some other things. So I think about my experience and what made that, what made me successful, and having supervisors who were trauma-informed. And so the thinking about the social and emotional hub of our minds that generates confidence, safety, and assurance that life is good, when that part of the brain is responsible for reasoning, impulse control, short-term memory, and judgment, they all light up. When all those parts of our brain light up and connect, children, adolescents, or adults, we remember what we learn, and we're able to develop new skills and improve our judgment. And this is what we need. We need organizations that are trauma informed, and that's what a lot of the work that we're doing here in Alaska is looking at disparities and equipping organizations that don't necessarily have peers, but I know that there are peers within them. They don't identify as peers, and we're really working off of what's called the curb effect, and like thinking about sidewalks and how curbs were originally created for people who have disabilities, but they serve everyone. Because what we're finding is that everything that survivors, that peers need, everyone needs.
So, Christina, are you suggesting that the peers do not need any unique or special types of support or supervisory activity?
So I think that we all do, right? And what I tell people is that I'm more qualified for the position I'm in now and less qualified for the position that I started out in. In a lot of ways, right out of jail and right out of psychiatric institutes, there were things that I knew to help people navigate through systems. Language, the language from poverty to middle class is completely different. And in a lot of ways, I've educated myself out of the relevance there. And so, of course, there's lots of different training to advance, and there's positions for everyone. But I think anybody could be a peer and do this work. Again, it's like Deb said, finding the right position for them and having an organization that supports them no matter where they're at within the employment process. Because there are people, completely out of jail, who have very little recovery time. They have incredible significance and importance, and it's really learning how to hone that. And I always shift that back on organizations rather than the person, rather than saying, you're not ready for this. And I would say, we're not ready for you.
I love that, turning it on its head. I think that that's really right on the money in terms of organizations being really ready to bring peers into the culture of the organization, because when you do, there's a change in the organizational culture, especially when it works well. It really, and Deb, your story, as you mentioned, is a real testament to that, how many of us have worked as clinicians, but we have our own personal stories, and making that okay within the organization humanizes it for everyone on so many levels. But I also know, Deb, you have some thoughts on training and supervision. You want to share some of that?
I do. One thing that I was thinking that is unique and that I think is really important is when we do training here, I train staff, new staff especially, is I want them to understand their role as a recovery advocate. Just by virtue of the fact that they're in recovery, that alone, when you walk into a hospital, when you walk onto the street, you bring with you something that isn't already there in that place. And so I really work with folks to teach them, and you watch the light bulbs go off, that the gift of recovery is that we get to be what we are through our work, through our presence, through our effort, and go into these places where it doesn't exist. In and of itself, that teaches, just in and of itself, by showing up, and then by conducting ourselves in the ways that we do, with respect, with listening, with making room for the other person to be what they are, to helping them, with what they need. That changes everything. That has really keeps me doing this work. It keeps blowing me away. Like doctors and nurses, when we go and we speak and we teach and we try to, dialogue with them about what's needed in emergency departments, we'll say, we don't meet people like you. And that blows me away every time that they acknowledge that, because they're meeting folks who are sick, who are struggling, who are suffering, who are going back and forth, to the hospital. So that's a really powerful thing. I spend a lot of time teaching people about what it means to be an advocate, what it means to have that presence, what it means to bring all of that everywhere you go, and how much that changes the world around us as we do the work we do. So it seems like it's a kind of a sideways thing, but it's not. It's as important as the actual engagement skills, the strategies, the active listening, and all of that. That's powerful, and it means we have to do our work. So that, I think, is a really critical piece of the training.
Okay. I also want to mention here that there's a number of certification programs developing nationwide, and there are credentials that the whole peer movement, it's highly controversial, but there are a number of certification programs, and that can be an enhancement for a lot of people. And so that's certainly something to check out. I'm going to shift here. We've got about 10 minutes left in this presentation, and I want to carve out some time for some of the questions from our participants. Deb, I want to start with you on this question, and that is, what suggestions do you have for creating a more peer-focused atmosphere and policy perspective within agencies or governments? So what are your tips for organizing and developing, strengthening the peer workforce, making organizations receptive? How do you work that culture?
Boy, that's such a great question, because I've been working on that for all these 15 years. First, we have to be at the table. I still find that state systems are doing their work considering themselves to be the experts without asking us to come and join them at the table while they're working on things. And they might lay it out later on and ask us what we think to react to it, but I keep being surprised that it doesn't at all touch the needs of folks, you know what I mean, and all of that. So I think you need to have folks who are not just peers, but are recovery advocates who understand things about language, things about culture shift, and the way to work with that, who need to be at the table in all those sorts of situations. So that's critical. Like, just getting us there is critical.
Christina, what about you? What thoughts do you have for creating a peer-positive culture in organizations and agencies?
I think I think a lot about bottom-up. Are you asking me or are you asking Christina? Am I speaking over Christina?
I was going to ask Christina to kind of add to your comments, Deb.
You can go ahead, Deb.
I think a lot about, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I think a lot about bottom-up. Bottom-up is what I think a lot about, that when we do this work well, we talk with the folks that are part of the community. What are the needs? Who are you? What is it that you'd like to see? Let us tell you what we're thinking. How do we put that together to create the kind of services, the kind of supports, the kind of community that would benefit you? And as I said before, it's really, I think a lot about finding your flavor. If we do this well, we have a community that's large enough that we make room, like a recovery center should have room for all the different factions, for the refuge recovery, for the smart recovery, for the folks that just want to meet and talk about being parents or women in recovery, that we make as much room as we can but by talking to and listening to people and letting them advise and guide us in terms of what they need and having them at the table to build the kind of services that we want to have. So you need to have an environment that allows you to do that and that makes room for that. So it can't be a top-down. It's got to be a bottom-up kind of system. That's really hard.
Christina, what would you add to that?
I agree. Okay. I would say that I would say that the cliches are true. Nothing about us without us, and if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And making sure that the policy. The other thing that I've learned is that if we don't change public opinion, we can't change public policy. What I've learned in my work in advocacy and systems change is that we've written and drafted beautiful bills that are now being changed because people aren't ready, because there's still a lot of stigma and myths about what peers do and who we are and what our role is and our significance. And I mean, and that could be its own thing. And talking about, so for now, I mean, my experience with peers is that the number of peers and survivors, so that we have a lot of statistics that shows that people entering treatment have been physically or sexually abused. People who've been incarcerated have been physically or sexually abused. People who are in our shelters for physical and sexual violence are struggling with alcohol and other drugs. And so we're working with agencies here in Alaska, and we're looking at disparities. So we're preparing the environment. We're talking about organizational culture. We're also talking about organizations that are traumatized themselves and what that looks like, and how to move through that and how to heal, because this work is hard, and self-preservation and how to stay in it, and how are we going to have longer than 5 years, which is what the burnout rate is, and that's information years are for anybody. But we're talking about sustainability and foundation and bringing it back to mission and vision and values, and making sure that our organizations are operating with the same principles that people need to survive and to thrive in recovery, and also making it not just acceptable but celebrated. You know, and I think that in my experience, that's when things really shifted for me, and how I saw myself and how I moved forward and how I grew. And there's been nothing greater than providing that space for other people, and I think that that's what our privilege is. that, that we have found freedom and we need to provide space for other people, and constantly checking in with them so that, that we see relevance. What you were talking about, Deb, that there are people in positions of power and privilege that are writing policy that directly impact people. This is not, trickle-down economics has never worked, especially within policy.
Okay, a couple of questions have come in that are kind of related, and I'm going to see if I can combine them. And Kyle, for example, is talking about, Christina, you had mentioned a few times about professionals working in the field who are not open about their lived experience. And another person, Christine, had talked about, are there any good models for incorporating peers and survivors into domestic violence and assault programs? But how do we harness and utilize some of the strength and capacity that we have in our staff who are actually in the closet, to coin a phrase? How do we help make it okay for people to draw on that experience, and how do we support people for doing that, and how do we use their knowledge and empower them to transfer their work based on their lived experience? Do we have to be a peer to be
I think that comes from a couple of different, so self-determination is really an important term when we're talking about the work. If we're not asking people with lived experience, then our organizations are not operating on self-determination. And so there's a couple of principles there. If we really celebrate what people's experiences are, their inherent knowledge of things that they've lived through, then we're going to create organizations that invite them into all aspects of that. And by hiring me, my experience, it kind of formed organically. So I did direct services for many years, and then I moved into a state level position that works on advocacy and systems change with support to member programs around the state. And so it always goes back to my story, and I pull strength from what I've been through, and know that no matter what it looks like, no matter what it feels like, that we can get through this. And then that's the story of peers. And so continuing to share my story, empowering other people to share their stories, and other people felt that it was acceptable. Within this model, we talk a lot about things that are maybe a little bit more culturally acceptable. So we talk about oppression and how oppression comes into the work. For instance, how I hated my body after I had a baby because of what society says about what women's bodies should look like, or the work-life balance and the false dichotomy of self-care, and how I'm supposed to take care of myself, but you don't pay me enough to do those. And so, all of these things, looking at these stories and these core beliefs that we have about ourselves and how we're not measuring up, and talking about people can understand that, and then making the link to other things and giving people space to be open and honest about the things that they're struggling with. And that we are all in survival mode at some point, whether we're just going to get through this day, I'm just going to get through this webinar, I'm just going to get through it till this paycheck, and that's an aspect that people can understand the experience that people have navigating through the systems and having substance use disorder or mental illness or trauma, which really is, whether that's short-term or long-term cognitive impairments, and that, and making it, normalizing it, constantly validating people's experiences and normalizing what's happened, so that we can create a space for more people to come and say, hey, you know what, I am struggling at home. I'm a domestic violence advocate, and my partner is incredibly abusive, but I'm embarrassed to talk about it. Or I'm a clinician who is struggling with alcohol, but I don't want to tell my boss because I'm going to get fired. Or I work for a reentry program and I got picked up on a DUI last week. These are the things that we talk about. And so I've just talked about I don't do direct services anymore, but it's also a way for me to continue to do direct services.
Okay, Christina, take a breath. Thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off because we are going to be closing down here in about 2 seconds. Thank you both for a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to continuing it another time. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And that will close our webinar.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.